always check the Italian pantry before you turn the oven on.
Well, ready as I can be, I think.
I do know that feeling all too well right now.
So do you know what's going on with the web page and people's ability to get to panels and stuff?
We had 15 attendees at the last panel that I was hosting,
Oh, that's good.
and that's about all I know right now.
I just know it was every time I went to the web page, I got error messages wherever I tried to go. I had to go back through emails to find the, join through Discord instructions.
I mean, I don't have video on, so.
Okay. I can report that the panel that I had, I'm Mel's son, by the way, had 29 people at least.
Yeah, my oldest son hosted a panel this morning and had 29 people watching. So there are people tuning in. And I know that on the Neverland chat, there were a couple of people already asking for the link. So that means people are interested.
Oh, good. I was talking to somebody who was listening to Steve Ranzik Tim, who's, I guess, talking right now, and he thought he might be the only person listening.
Well, it's set up so that you can't really see anybody else. I think you can all, or they can all chat, but I was having technical issues, so I couldn't see the chat on the last panel that I was working. So this time I've got everything set up, so I should be able to see the chat and get you questions and all of that.
Awesome.
Yes.
Is my audio okay on your end?
Yes.
Okay. I have some earbuds that have a microphone in them, but I think they sound tinnier than my microphone on the computer.
Yeah, no, you sound fine right now.
Great. Perfect.
Yep. All right, I'm going to go back onto mute because I've got all kinds of background stuff going on, but I at least wanted to say hi.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely. Oh, real quick, did you want this recorded?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, I will make sure to start recording as soon as we start the actual panel, okay?
Okay.
All righty, thank you.
Yourselves and make some sort of opening statement about what's your connection or interest in alternate history. So John, would you start?
I'm John Barnes. I've done a number of alternate histories over the ages, including one that was sort of steampunk before the term was coined, called Washington's Dirigible. Was from a series of books whose names was General's Name apostrophe Technology that didn't exist for the general. And there's a lot of interesting breakpoints in American history. That's actually one of the things that one of the problems that I have is that I can really enjoy researching a breakpoint, and then I find that I'm not really very interested in the stories of the people after the breakpoint. So I'm a good idea guy and a relatively poor work finisher.
Dana?
Actually, it's a Dana.
Dana, sorry.
Yeah. I'll be honest, I've written maybe one alternate history as part of the Divided States of America. And it was a lot of fun because I took the story in a direction that nobody had done before. So it's on a website somewhere. Are you leaving? Okay. And the cat, Sadara, she just left.
Corey?
Hey, so I haven't done a lot of alternate history. I wrote a steampunk story for Gavin Grant and Kelly Link's Steampunk ! Young Adult Anthology. That's actually an alternate Canada, I suppose. It's set in muddy York and Toronto, where Steve and I are from, and it's about the kids who get maimed in the great information processing mills, who end up working for a Fagin, begging, and who murder him, cure his hide, turn him into an automaton using the praxis they've gained working in the mills, and create a workers' cooperative that fronts him to the nuns. So that's I think my major contribution to the genre thus far. Charlie Strauss and I once wrote a fun little story in which Jack Valenti became the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission and banned general purpose computers, but that was more of a gag. These days, though, I think the reason I'm on this panel maybe is that I'm at work on a new novel that is an alternate present novel, I suppose. It's a post-Green New Deal novel whose timeline starts about 2 years ago, and which our world is already not. And I am writing a science fiction novel that is very much a contrafactual called The Lost Cause. And it's about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist terrorists after a successful Green New Deal and the creation of the first generation in a century that doesn't fear its future.
And Steve?
Hi, Steve Sterling, published under SM Sterling. I do a lot of alternate history. I wanted to be a history professor in my first incarnation. Then I learned what teaching assistant meant. And I generally use alternate history settings even when it's not readily apparent. If I do near future SF, if you look carefully, it's always an alternate history. This preserves me from the embarrassment of of not predicting the future well, which science fiction authors are terrible at. Even worse than professional futurists, which is a big thing. And I'm currently working on a series called the Black Chamber series. Just finished the 4th book, and it's set in a world in which President Taft vapor-locked just after losing the Ohio primary in 1912, and Teddy Roosevelt swept in, took over the Republican Party, renamed it the Progressive Republican Party, and became president interminably. So that's been an enormous amount of fun. It's my sort of homage to the great era of the pulps. And Teddy Roosevelt was more or less a pulp hero in real life. So, and his life was inspired by the adventure fiction he read as a kid and wanted to live up to. So it's the life reflects art and art reflects life thing.
Well, certainly alternate histories have been more popular lately, or at least they seemed so. The Man in the High Castle, very interesting alternate history, both as Philip K. Dick wrote it and then as how it was done for television for Netflix, I think. I really enjoyed Yesterday, which I think is very much an alternate history story, which is what if the Beatles had never existed, what would our world look like today? That was a lot of fun. What do you guys think is the attraction to alternate history? Is there a special fascination to it or a special interest?
Well, everybody has alternate histories of their own life playing in their heads a fair amount of the time. What if I'd done this? What if I hadn't done that? What if no one found out about that extremely embarrassing thing? You can't help but play them in your head. And everybody who knows anything about their own family history knows that all sorts of grossly unlikely things happened. Like my grandparents, my maternal grandmother was shipwrecked in 1912 in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Her ship hit an iceberg. No, it wasn't the Titanic, but same year. And everyone was rescued, and she'd been on her way to Boston, but they were taken to St. John's, Newfoundland. And there she met my grandfather, who owned a hotel there where some of them were put up. And that's one of the reasons I exist. And on the other side, grandparents were a VAD nurse who'd been bombed by Zeppelins in London during World War I, and a junior officer who was gassed at Passchendaele in 1917. He was sent to the hospital she was at to recover. They fell in love. Their families both hated it because they were 3 social grades apart, and in England in those days that was a big thing. So they eloped and went to Peru because it was as far from England as they could get. And those 2 sets of extremely unlikely circumstances are why I exist. So, lots of alternate histories don't have an SM Sterling in them.
I think that's interesting. Corey, what do you think?
I think that family history is definitely something that I think about when I think about this. I also have colorful things. My grandmother was a child soldier in the siege of Leningrad, and she got knocked up by my grandfather in Siberia when she was 15, and then they deserted from the Red Army, and lots of things happened that kind of culminated with me ending up in Canada and now in the US. I think as well that because history is so contestable, and you have these hegemonic narratives about who was good and who was bad, whether the frontier was open or stolen, whether America was founded on individual liberty or slavery, that and they're all true, right? All of these things are true, and it's a trite commonplace that history is written by the winners. But I think that when we start to reckon with the fractal individual nature of history and the great variance between different entities' recollection of history and the way that history has been constructed and reconstructed at different times, that it really invites us to speculate. I was absolutely transformed by a book by the historian Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. That's a very closely researched, primary source dependent history of disasters, primarily American disasters, that are remembered as moments in which people revealed their bestial nature and attacked and set upon one another, and in which the great trauma was experienced by the rich and powerful, who themselves were most besieged and who had to defend themselves. And what she finds is that that's not how the people who are the notional villains of those stories experienced it. They experienced a moment of enormous mutual aid and solidarity, like after the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, when General Funston was marching his troops out of the Presidio to defend the wealthy. The everyday people were, opening up their larders and cooking for one another, trying to extinguish the fires that General Funston set under the misapprehension that he knew how to use controlled demolitions to make fire breaks, and so on. And so you have these completely different narratives of what happened, and one was written by the winners and one was written by the losers. And as the stories of the losers come to light, I think, especially at moments of crisis like this, we are inflamed to imagine what the victors of this moment might write about if they're not us and our descendants, and what they might say about us.
John?
Well, I think for me, it's partly it's that feeling about just how close the alternate histories are. I mean, when talk about a divergence point or a break point, is very little things make very big differences. Favorite example, June 9, 1864. For political reasons, it was impossible to get Ben Butler, general, out of the Union Army. He was, in the opinion of U.S. Grant, the stupidest man he'd ever met. However, Ben Butler was actually a rather brilliant administrator. In a modern army, he'd have been put over in logistics, never allowed it near any actual fighting, and trucks of stuff would have arrived beautifully all the time. Great administrator, lousy general, straightforward. So in order to keep him out of trouble during what became the Battle of the Wilderness, they gave him his own army to command, the Army of the James, and sent him and several tens of thousands of men up the James River to make sudden threatening motions at Richmond to keep Lee pinned back against the city. Well, Lee had already left. And in fact, Richmond was defenseless. And in fact, when they got there, there was nothing between Ben Butler and Richmond, except that Grant had appointed 2 junior generals under him with the instruction that unless both of you give him permission, Ben Butler can't get off the script. And his script is land at Bermuda 100 and squat there and scare people. So for 17 hours, he tried to locate his other junior general. And during that time, Beauregard, the Confederate general who was in charge of defending Richmond, managed to find troops and fortify the place. But on that one day in June of 1864, if Ben Butler had simply thrown all caution to the winds, it was a march of a few miles, taken Richmond, Richmond would have fallen behind Lee, Civil War over, and a brilliant administrator in the early spring of 1864, an election year, with huge connections to the Republican Party, would just have been the man who won the war. And President Butler, well, we know from Butler's later record, Butler favored an extremely harsh Reconstruction. For one thing, he wanted to just take the South and repartition it, organize it into a new set of states as a giant gerrymander. I think his numbers actually were he thought he could carve out 4 black majority, 2 white Whig, and 1 wretchedly, weirdly shaped place where they would shove the remaining slaveholders until they could get them to leave the country. And, and the trouble was he just didn't quite have the nerve to defy Grant's orders.
This is why I think history is so fascinating, because the more you dig into it, the more interesting stuff you find like that. I started as a history major in school too. I thought I was going to be a history teacher, and I never could get my handle around the really big thrusts of history, but I loved a good storyteller in front of the classroom who would talk about the characters and the decisions and the emotions that went into these really big, implacable looking forces. You can say Reformation, and it had to happen, or Reconstruction, or the Civil Rights era, but really they're individual stories of people who made decisions and tried to make a difference in their time, and they did somehow. And a lot of times it looked accidental. Dana, what do you think is the interest?
I do a lot of personal stuff. I have an ancestress who was a distant cousin of John Adams. And by getting in contact with other members of the family, I found out they can't find her death certificate, they can't find her grave. So she got turned into a vampire in one of my stories. But what the story was really about was what would have happened if John Adams had not been part of the revolution, because he also got turned into a vampire. And it was very interesting because it's modern day and we are still under English control. And through a whole bunch of crazy set of circumstances, he ends up actually defeating the British finally, but in modern day. I forgot, I've actually written a lot more alternate history than I thought I had. But
we start thinking about it, we say, oh yeah, I have some titles.
Yeah, I had said that. That was called From Family Blood is Born. So it was very interesting. I tend to use a lot of personal stuff in my stories because I have huge life experience.
Mhm.
So it's a lot of fun.
Fun. I remember when I was in school, the kind of fun that we're talking about here mostly meant reading a lot and taking notes and thinking deeply about what's going on, which I didn't think was fun at all when I was in school, but I sure found it to be fun when I started to write.
Mhm.
And I wanted to answer questions for alternate histories. I like secret histories too. I wrote a story where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, when he's a young man, meets a much younger H.G. Wells who's going to London for the first time. And it's just about them talking to each other on a train ride. But I spent a couple weeks trying to learn enough to sound even close to what it would be like to be on a train to London during that time period. And, what would people sound like? I was wondering what challenges or resources do you guys lean heavily on to write your alternate histories?
Sorry, before we move on from that, I actually had another thought. I was wondering if I could jump back in here.
Whoa, heck, easy.
It occurs to me that one of the reasons that American alternate history is so compelling and so frequently written is that America has at many moments, oh, hi, Jan. America has at many moments in its history balanced on a kind of knife edge between more than one possibility. It represents so many fragile compromises. We saw this really come to a head in the 2016 election. And I think one of the reasons the 2016 election is the source of so much debate about different factors, third parties and Russian interference and so on and so forth, is because it was decided by a rounding error, right? And so every single factor, when you're decided by a rounding error, like anything that makes a difference could be dispositive, could completely alter the outcome. And that, given that America is not a nation with a consensus, right? That it's a nation of multiple fracture lines that at multiple junctures has an outcome that turns on a coin toss that completely alters the course of the nation. I think it does invite these alternate histories in a way that maybe other regions don't.
Well, consensus usually means my gang is big enough to hit you over the head with a bat if you disagree with me. That's also the reason why a lot of alternate history turns on wars and high politics. It's situations where a small number of individual decisions can make really enormous differences, and it's documentable. You can trace down the individual decision paths. But that's not just a matter of generals and the emperors, although they do have more decision-making power than most of us, and often they make decisions and don't get what they expected. But I was doing a lot of research on World War I for my latest series, and I was studying the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And I looked at it and I read it more. The more I read about it, the more I thought someone must have read about this when they were coming up with the characters of the Three Stooges. There were 4 assassins recruited locally, trained in Serbia, sent back to kill Franz Ferdinand. One just gave up when he got to Sarajevo and just wandered off. Another threw a bomb, which missed, then tried to commit suicide with his poison pill, but it turned out to be past its sell-by date and just gave him a stomachache. So he ran away and jumped into a river to drown himself, and it turned out to be 12 inches deep that time of year. So all he did was sprain his ankle. And then Gavrilo Princip essentially gave up when the car didn't go past where it was supposed to and went to have lunch. And then he came out from the cafe, and Franz Ferdinand had decided to go and visit the people injured in the bombing, and his driver had taken a wrong turn and had stalled the engine right in front of the cafe, and the car didn't have a rear gear in the early days in automobiles. So they were figuring out how to back it up in this narrow street, and Princip comes out of the cafe, and there is Franz Ferdinand and his wife in the car right in front of them. Now you could not possibly write that scene if you made it up out of whole cloth, because
it's
no
basically Pulp Fiction. It's the final sequence of Pulp Fiction.
Yeah. No one would believe it. And yet the destinies of millions and the meeting of my grandparents depended on that pistol shot in front of the cafe by Gavrilo Princip.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on something that Corey said, which hadn't occurred to me. Is alternate history a uniquely or predominantly American fiction form? Is there
Not at all.
Australian alternate histories or French alternate histories written by
Not
French
some.
authors? Or
Oh, everywhere. I mean, that's you know, it was, of course, the famous example is Livy. The yeah, if Alexander had turned west instead of east,
Mhm.
you know, and ever since, more or less, as soon as you've got a nation, somebody is saying "if only" or "what if." There's
Right.
an enormous Polish tradition because they got the daylights kicked out of them for so many centuries. And so they have an enormous number of divergence points of if only we hadn't lost that time.
Mhm.
I wonder if those pieces would have the same interest to a person who wasn't raised in that culture and didn't have that historical background. I'd have to believe that a lot of the power for a writer in writing an alternate history is that you're drawing on your readers' pre-knowledge of what actually happened. And that's part of the fun of reading an alternate history. If you watch the Watchmen, right, the movie of it or the comic version of it, well, most of the American audience knew who Richard Nixon was and knew what the Vietnam War was, and it's playing against that common shared background and then spins off of it. If I didn't know that common shared background, I wonder if that story wouldn't lose a lot of its punch.
I
Well,
mean,
that's
I
a big
think
problem
there's
with
that.
editors.
That's sorry.
Uh,
Say again, Steve.
It's a problem with editors. They're resistant to periods of history that aren't big in popular culture or popular knowledge. Of course, you know, there's an old saying, it isn't what you don't know that'll kill you, it's what you think you know that ain't so.
Mhm.
And that's a big problem with histories too, because you know, the general knowledge, the general level of historical knowledge is low, even for just the official versions. So, you know, I had to really do some fancy footwork to persuade them that the 1912 election was something I could make publishable material out of.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's probably, in terms of context loss, it's probably like reading Swift or Dante without knowing the personalities being lampooned.
Mhm.
Or even, you know, the difference between reading Alice in Wonderland and reading Martin Gardner's annotated Alice, that you know, all of that subtextual subtweeting business probably does inflame the reader in a way that is like unique to its context. But I think that there are so many examples of successful work whose context has been absolutely vaporized by history. You know, like you have to be Ada Palmer or another very talented medievalist to read Dante and understand who he's making fun of. But you know, we still read Dante.
He's just making fun of them so effectively.
Yeah, well, that's true, right? Yeah, he's definitely lampooning it. Yeah, Evelyn Waugh does the same thing. All of Evelyn Waugh's early novels are the villains are thinly veiled versions of his hated tutor at Oxford, and that only stopped when the guy killed himself after like the 7th or 8th of them came out. And you know, he's a despicable character, irrespective of whether you were in, you know, the same dorm as Waugh. So
Yeah. Well, he's not the only science fiction author who did that. There was a guy who did a review of one of Dave Drake's early novels, in which he said, "This is war porn, and no one who'd ever been near a real battle could have written it." Of course, you know, Dave was in Vietnam and the invasion of Cambodia. He was loading ammunition in a tank during that one. So ever since that, the guy's name is Platt. In every one of Dave's long works, you'll find a really despicable character whose name is Platt.
And inspiration
You know,
can
Platt,
come from strange.
Platt will be known for generations because of that.
Inspiration can come from some really strange place. Hatred is one of the better sources. My actual you know, graduate training in history, I was a theater historian. Ubu great French play written by and the founder of many movements and all the rest of that stuff. And it was Jarry essentially was still years later bitter about what an awful chemistry teacher he had, and recalling fondly all the nasty jokes that he and his brother made about the chemistry teacher. And so Père Ubu in the thing is possibly the most loathsome character in comedy.
That's the power of being the writer. You got to play these little inside jokes with yourself and
Mhm.
Thanks. But well, maybe that changes the question a little bit. Not, what is your research stuff, but a lot of times there are arguments that you can't really write science fiction unless you know science, and clearly that's not true. If you read a lot of science fiction, do you have to know history to write alternate history?
Something about it.
Yeah, I would say you have to know a little bit about it. I mean, while we were sitting here, I got a great story idea, which I just wrote down, based on the blizzards that happened between 1886 and 1888.
Mhm.
There were some interesting outcomes to that it's not even taught in history.
Mhm.
Where
Yeah.
what happened? I mean, I spent a whole summer researching from 1865 to 1940 and found out all kinds of stuff that's not taught in the history books.
Mhm.
As soon as you start reading, you find stuff that you forgot or nobody cared to mention, and that becomes fascinating. That becomes the pivot point sometimes in the fiction that you're writing, because you found out this cool thing, like your whole story about the assassination that starts World War One.
Yeah.
A lot of people know that story who know anything about how World War One began, but for others, they're just like, "Oh, what? You're kidding me? That's amazing."
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Corey.
I was going to say that, we can imagine an alternate history story that was very successful that related to very recent events, right? I mean, I could easily see the New York Times running a, 1,500 word vignette that's an article celebrating the foresight of a different president as the first cases emerged in Wuhan, and a counterpoint that's like a bitter argument from someone from the Trump side, Steve Bannon now living in disgrace in Hungary with Viktor Orban or something, complaining that if his guy had gotten in, he'd have saved even more lives and done better for the economy. That kind of alternate history is ultimately doing the thing that a lot of alternate history is doing, which is making an assertion about where the room was for human agency as against the great forces of history, and thereby ascribing blame or attributing credit to someone for something they did as being an agent in history and not the prisoner of its forces.
Yeah, I think also you have to make a distinction between different types of different outcomes. Like, World War One might not have happened that year. It could have happened a couple of years earlier. Maybe it could have happened a couple of years later. The parties could have been different, and that would have made a big difference rolling downhill. On the other hand, to make an alternate history in which everyone in Europe becomes a Theravada Buddhist in 1914, you'd have to do some really fancy footwork, because that is one of those big, huge cultural inertia, millions of different individual decisions, things. And speaking to the question of research, I think besides finding like bare facts about who decided to do what, there's an old saying that past is a different country, is another country, and they do things differently there. One of the basic assumptions that people who don't do a lot of history, and even some who do, is that people in the past were pretty much the same as the people they know, and that is just so not so. Good historical novelists deal with that effectively. One of my favorites is Mary Renault. She wrote a whole bunch of stuff, mainly set in the classical period, and she did it very well. She immersed herself in it. And there's a scene where the hero of one of her stories, I think it's The Mask of Apollo, comes across his father, who's been killed by agents of the tyrants who were running Athens at the time. And he says to him, "Avenge my blood." And the hero has been presented very sympathetically. He's a pupil of Socrates. He's a kind and intelligent man. And he stoops to his father and he says, "How do you think I could be so base of soul as to forgive my enemies?" And that's a nice point, because all human beings feel the impulse for revenge if they feel injured. We tend to treat it as like a dirty impulse that ideally you should suppress, or at least make excuses for. To this guy, it's not a dirty impulse, it's a moral obligation. Vengeance is like good. And it's the shock of otherness. And I think a really good story, even one that's set in the fairly recent past, should do that because, you know, our grandparents were not like us, especially when they were young. Their moral reflexes were different. The way they perceived the world was different.
E.M. Forster, famously, essay about medieval and ancient literature, pointed out that the modern idea of duty to country is actually pretty recent, and that, for example, Dante's lowest circle of hell is reserved for people who betrayed a good friend on behalf of a greater cause. And you know, and Forster, being Forster, finishes off with that wonderful line about that if he should be forced to choose between betraying one good friend and betraying his country, he would hope he would have the guts to betray his country.
Although I think it was Winston Churchill who came back at that and said that the guy who will betray his country will almost certainly also betray his friend.
And that again is Churchill being essentially from a different set of values there.
Yeah, of course, all human beings have group identities. We're a social species. It's just that how the group identities are perceived and conceptualized differs like starkly between periods and, of course, within subcultures within any given social setting.
One of my collateral
go ahead.
uncles, who was an old-time Democrat who practiced what used to be called honest graft, used to say that, look, if a guy won't take care of his brother-in-law, how can you expect him to take care of his city?
I wanted to mention a colleague of ours, Ada Palmer, the medievalist and science fiction writer who's tenured in the history department at the University of Chicago, where she researches and teaches the Renaissance, particularly the Black Death and heterodox information, homosexuality, heresy, all kinds of things, treason, and so on. And Ada is famous on campus for an annual LARP, where she enlists her undergraduates to spend 4 weeks reenacting the election of the Medici's Pope. And she gives each of them the identity of real historic personages. And she then just turns them loose to form their own power blocks, create alliances, betray one another, and so on, you know, by like some combination of like getting together at a bar and sending each other text messages and whatever it takes. And then they have an investiture ceremony, and Ada's got a Google alert for theater companies that are selling off old costumes. So she dresses up the whole undergraduate class in Florentine medieval garb for the investiture. And in the final four are always two of the same people in every iteration of the game. Two of the people are always the same because the forces of history bear down on that moment in a way that makes those two inevitable possible contenders. But the other two of the final four have never been the same. And for Ada, the lesson is that the great forces of history parameterize what we can do, but they aren't dispositive, right? Like that they are the space in which human free will is exercised. And of course, those great forces of history are just another name for the echoes of agency exercised by human beings beforehand. They're just forces that were set in motion by other people.
Yeah.
I
Marx
always think of that.
Marx once said that human beings make history, but they don't make it just as they please. One of his more felicitous moments.
We see a lot in history discussions about these greater forces, and certainly when you write alternate history, you have to think that. So would like a common step-off point for alternative history is if somehow you manage to neutralize Adolf Hitler before he takes over Germany. But are there forces that are at work there that would cause many of the same or similar things to happen without that one individual? Are there other people to fill in that, the historical ecological niche occupied by Adolf Hitler? So maybe you can change things, but you know, you can't be what you ain't, as they say.
Yeah.
One of my favorite nightmares is imagine somehow or other Hitler dies in late 1940. The most likely person to take power after him would be Himmler. And that would have been a much worse war, just straight up.
But you might have somebody to take his place who's actually a better tactician than Hitler was, and maybe didn't throw his forces around the wrong way.
On the other hand,
Sorry, go ahead,
ahead.
Steve. I was just going to say the modern version of this is asking ourselves whether Trump is a cause or an effect. And, you
Oof.
know, I'm of the opinion that he just doesn't seem bright enough or to have the executive function to be a cause. And that really he's properly best understood as an effect.
You don't
Yeah,
have to be brilliant to
Plenty
be
of
a
arguments
cause.
about that. I'm sorry, Steve.
I was just going to say that you don't have to be brilliant to be a cause.
Hmm.
You know, moving back to Hitler, everybody, well, most people in Germany resented the result of World War I. They lost. They didn't like that. They resented the Versailles Treaty. They wanted to break its bonds. They wanted to get the territory they'd lost back, all sorts of stuff like that.
Mhm.
But, you know, I've studied the period in some detail, and most of the German elite, the generals, the industrialists, and that sort of thing, didn't think Germany could win a replay of World War I. They thought they'd lose, and the consequences would be even worse. So when Hitler nearly started World War II over the Sudeten crisis in 1938, there were serious conspiracies to overthrow him. It was the fact that Hitler kept succeeding and that the French and British kept giving him stuff that eventually put him in a position strong enough to carry the nation to war over the serious doubts of the generals, the economic elite, the political establishment, and even a lot of highly placed Nazis. Hermann Goring, for example, didn't want to do it. He thought the odds were just not good enough. But, you know, Hitler kept winning.
He was the
And-
Lindsey Graham of his time.
Yeah. Well, no, Hitler didn't want World War II. He wanted certain results and he was prepared to fight to get them, but he certainly didn't want a replay of World War I, where Germany was ground down by superior numbers. What he had in mind was a series of limited, swift campaigns to accomplish certain goals. And up until 1940, everything was going swimmingly. You know, the French collapsed. That was like a total surprise to everyone, even the Germans. And, you know, then what he wanted to do was make a deal with the British where they'd concede him hegemony in Europe and serve as a shield against the Americans on the other side of the Atlantic. He didn't anticipate conquering or Britain or turning it into a Nazi state. Didn't want to. Didn't think that was a realistic proposition. And then Churchill refused to do a deal because Churchill was a demented, optimistic romantic. No, seriously, all the alternatives as prime minister of Britain in 1940 would have done a deal with Hitler after the fall of France. Because, you know, if you looked at it in a purely rational realpolitik sense, there was absolutely no prospect of Britain alone beating Germany. And most of the members of the British upper classes didn't have any confidence the Americans would come in. And no one anticipated Hitler attacking Russia. Even Stalin didn't. So they thought they had, a lot of them thought they had no alternative but to do a deal. Churchill managed to carry the country along and keep the war going, and that was crucial because if the war had ended in 1940, if the British had made a deal with the Germans, that was what Hitler wanted, and so that he could clear the decks to attack the Soviet Union without any distractions or any other fronts or subtracting resources from the effort. And if he'd had that, he almost certainly would have won, and we would have been totally fucked. FDR wanted to bring the United States into the war, but it was politically impossible for him. And that comes back to the big impersonal forces. American opinion was pro-Allied, but it was also very, very, very much against getting into the war. Then the Japanese, in a fit of nationalistic madness, attacked someone who's 10 times their strength. And, you know, the country's unified. But this is all a series of like contingent actions by a really small number of people making the decisions.
If you guys don't mind, we're going to get to a point here where there may be some questions from our audience. Could we shift gears a bit and get a recommendation from everybody of what you think is a really well done alternate history that you've read or seen that you would recommend that other people ought to take a look at? Dana, do you have a thought about something that's you thought was really well done?
That's a good question. I would actually recommend going in and finding the Divided States of America, which quite a few local authors are in, because it goes by the whole thing of the US being divided into these different states with kind of a general set of guidelines. And then it's really interesting to see what some of the authors did with that. I know I had a lot of fun doing it.
John,
They're
what
just short stories.
I only recommend, I recommend this one entirely because it's a way to sort of broaden your perspective on alternate history, or on what some of the possibilities of it are. William Burroughs, Cities of the Red Knight. It's imagining that the temporary tiny pirate republic of Libertatia managed to survive instead of being wiped out by the fact that everybody in it was a pirate and it was a lousy organization. Not only managed to survive, but discovered that arming indigenous peoples was a way to keep Europe off their back. Fascinating book.
Steve?
I would recommend Harry Turtledove's Ruled Britannia. It's about an alternative outcome to the Spanish Armada in 1588. And the primary viewpoint character is William Shakespeare, with a secondary viewpoint character of Jose Lopez de Vega, the great Spanish playwright of the 16th century and early 17th. And, you know, you've got all this political intrigue and stuff, but it's told from the viewpoint of two playwrights. And it's magnificently done, and the language is handled very well too. I thought it was brilliant. And
Kit Marlowe lives, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Corey, what are your thoughts?
I've got a couple. I'm sorry if that violates the rule. The first one is a book called The Mirage by Matt Ruff, who's best known lately for Lovecraft Country, and who's married to Lisa Gold, who's one of the great historic researchers of our time and is Neil Stephenson's researcher. And The Mirage opens on the 9th of November 2001 in the United States of Arabia, when the Twin Towers in Dubai are destroyed by a plane that's been hijacked by a couple of crusaders from the failed states of America, who insist against all evidence that there is another world in which the situation is reversed. And this turns out to be the thing that spurs or that hands power to the hawkish, reactionary secret police senator Osama bin Laden, who is finally able to embark on the war against terror he's dreamt of all these years. But he is in some ways hampered by Muammar Gaddafi, whose oil-rich technology hub, which hosts the Library of Alexandria, the free library that anyone can edit, whose excerpts elucidate many of these concepts, and who's something of a cowboy and a libertarian. It is a spectacular goddamn novel in every single way, and I cannot speak highly enough of it. And then the other book that I'll mention, because it's similar to the one that I think Jim just mentioned, or maybe it was John just mentioned, the called Pirate Utopia by Bruce Sterling from Tachyon. Oh, someone in the chat says, what book was that? It's called The Mirage by Matt Ruff. And this book by Bruce Sterling, Pirate Utopia, is set in the island off the coast of Italy that was conquered by the Futurists briefly and became a torpedo factory. And it's about fascists, anarchists, and pirates feuding with one another in this temporary autonomous zone that really existed. And it is a surreal and brilliant Bruce Sterlingian kind of novel. So that's Pirate Utopia by Bruce Sterling.
I was thinking about the things that I liked too, but I was also doing some reading just to come up with titles that other people mentioned. And what I ended up with is some titles I really want to read now. I don't know, but they sound fascinating. So Robert Charles Wilson's Darwinia just sounds cool. It's a story that takes place in 1912 when history is changed by a thing called the miracle. And all of old world Europe is replaced by Darwinia, which is this sort of weird, exotic, jungle-ish nightmare. That sounds like a cool concept. If I was an editor and somebody pitched that on an elevator, I'd say, well, yeah, I'd like to see that. Eric Flint, who I've listened to a lot, talked to a lot, very, experienced guy. I'd like to read 1632, which is, a transplant kind of, the thing I have here, the town of Grantville and its power plant are sent from the year 2000 in West Virginia to 1631 in central Germany in the middle of the barbaric 30 Years' War. That's a cool concept. That's a really sounds good. And Harry Turtledove has already been mentioned, but I'd like to read The Guns of the South. That sounds like a fascinating novel too, which is an alternative look at the Civil War and how things might have been fought. And of course, he's very learned on those things. He spends a lot of time researching and reading them. Somebody asked a question from the audience, which was how much, let me see, how is this? Jim Henderson asked this. He says, when you say researched an event, what do you consider sufficient research related to an event?
That's really because I've been sort of meaning to work. I've been meaning to work this in somewhere. I like branch points. I like events. But there are other ways to do things, and I've used them at times. One is that you can kind of think of any given society as having several possible alternate states. The civil rights movement in the United States tried to break out, actually did a pretty good job of breaking out during the Grant administration, tried again during Teddy Roosevelt's administration. The possibility that it might break out again after World War I is a big part of the huge repression of the teens and 20s. And there's not necessarily any evidence that they, you can write a worse world in which it gets squashed again in the 50s and 60s, or you could write one where it broke out earlier. I mean, both are, but there was always this alternate state in which there was going to be progress on civil rights, on multiracial civil rights. And at that point, it may be the case that what you want to know is the states, the conditions that go with it, and the event for getting from one to the other may just not be terribly important. So the research may be very small on that.
Steve, were you calling for attention there or giving me, I got 1 minute left?
No, that was just, as it happens in my Black Chamber series, the Jim Crow gets destroyed in the teens and 20s. So great minds think alike.
Okay. One thing that nobody has mentioned and that I discovered in my research was that weather plays a huge role in a lot of things that happened. And nobody ever actually kind of looks at it from that standpoint.
546 AD, the triple year without a summer, the center of that coincides with Justinian's attempt to reconquer Italy and basically get the Western Empire going again. And that's a big part of why it fizzles.
And the year without a summer, just a little over 200 years ago, is the year that a young Mary Shelley went and holed up in Geneva, or just outside of Geneva, while famine-stricken refugees staggered past in great hordes and lightning strikes hit and hit again. And she thought of a story about a man in a castle trying to steal fire from the gods. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and one of the things that's not mentioned when they talk about the eruption of Mount St. Helens is the fact that I was in Idaho when that happened, and we were just starting to warm up to summer, and immediately it got cold and it rained every single day. I remember that.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Grand Junction, which was half the country away, we were sweeping a half-inch of ash off our cars every day for a week. And
We
among,
had months.
natural events, that was not the biggest one of the last couple hundred years. It was just a local.
This is where Steve could do a fast commercial for the Peshawar Lancers.
Well, yeah, I did an alternate history in which in the in the 1870s, a comet strikes the Earth. And among other consequences, Benjamin Disraeli becomes a Hindu avatar of several deities. That sort of thing does happen. We'd all be like highly evolved velociraptors if the Chichikov impact hadn't hit, and we'd be talking about an alternative history in which those little scuttling mammals got a chance to evolve into something. So, yeah, things come out of left field and they reformat everything, and they can happen or not happen, and that's just what you have to deal with.
I like to think I'd be a barely evolved velociraptor myself.
One of those velociraptors that hang out in the alley and smoke cigarettes.
Read science fiction, watch cartoons.
Do you think that there are certain places in history that have been hit upon too often, that this is everybody's takeoff point for alternate histories? What are your thoughts on the overused ones, and what would be an interesting underused one?
World War II, the American Civil War, both overused grossly.
Agreed on
And
that.
always done by reversing the result. I mean, you never have the scenario where, say, in 1936 or 7, American engineers run across fission, start doing it for power plants. We've got a few tons of plutonium on hand at the beginning of the war, and the issue of the Axis gets settled in an afternoon. That's not I do not believe I could sell that to any editor.
Yeah, I'm really tired of people assassinating Hitler. I'm even tired of stories in which people are like, stop trying to assassinate Hitler. And there's like time cops whose job it is to stop people from assassinating Hitler. Someone who did a really good job of this last year was Annalee Newitz with Future of Another Timeline, which is about a world in which men's rights activists are traveling through time to eliminate feminism. And it's told from the point of view of a woman who shares some of Annalee's own history as a young person in the Orange County punk scene in the 80s. And it's about this group of women who called themselves the Harriet Tubman Society after the first African-American senator, who are fighting a time war with these MRAs who are determined to put women in their place. It's really quite a novel.
Oh yes, I've read that one. It was good.
Novel, or is it awful?
Well, a really good series.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
A TV series was Timeless, which was started out one thing and became an alternate history, which was really good. And I've got a whole bunch of new ideas for stories, guys. Thanks.
I don't know that title, Timeless.
Timeless. That was the series, Timeless.
Well, now I have a new thing to watch.
Like really good.
As it might be. God, I had it there and then I lost it. I forgot what the thought was.
Yeah.
Here's a therapeutic nature of alternate history stories. I was teaching a science fiction class to high schoolers, and part of the assignment was they all had to write a science fiction story as part of the class. And none of them came in thinking it was a creative writing class. They thought it was a lit class, so this takes them back. And I had a student in there who was pretty much a non-reader, and one of these reluctant kids who got put in science fiction because he couldn't pass anything else, and a total redneck. And every time we talked about politics or anything that came up like that, there's nothing he said that I ever agreed with, and I don't think he agreed with anything I said. So when he wanted to write a science fiction story, he said, I'd like to write an alternative history. I would like to send a fully armed American serviceman back to the beginning of the Civil War and have him join the Army of the South so the South wins. And he wanted this to happen for totally racist reasons, right? We were going to kick the coloreds out of the country once the South wins. But what was interesting about it is I said, sure, go ahead and write it. But where are you going to send your soldier, and what's he going to do? And so the kid started doing research, and he realized that he could not send back a soldier with enough stuff that he could carry to win one of these battles with thousands of men on both sides and millions of bullets flying. You couldn't do it. So he came back after a week of this, and he said, I'm going to send back a sniper, and I want a sniper to pick off the leaders of the North. And I said, well, all right, who are you going to pick off? You're only going to get a couple of them probably before you get caught. There's a lot of people be concerned about that. And so he started researching that. And he came back, and in his research, he had read about, the Black abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. He'd read a Frederick Douglass essay about what it was like to be enslaved. And he said, Mr. Van Pelt, I can't write this story. It was awful. What was happening was awful. And he ended up writing a different story. But when he went to college, he majored in history. And last I heard, he was still teaching high school history at Cherry Creek High School. And it all started with that science fiction assignment where he had to write an alternative history. I always took that as kind of a success as the story goes. So alternative histories may have some social worth.
Yeah, actually, I think one of the benefits of alternative history is to decenter one's own life. It's the benefit of history in general, but alternate histories can do it in a more vivid and immediate way. Make you realize that this particular point in history is not particularly important just because you happen to be alive in it.
I think we have handled some of the questions. I kind of wove them in as we were going along, and there are other comments here too about weather events. Jim Henderson again weighs in with the tides and winds that prevented William from invading in June of 1066. If he'd done that, he almost certainly would have lost, and other things like that. But we do only have 5 minutes left. So if you have something you'd like to pitch of your own, or you would like to sum up, your thoughts about your life in alternate history, this is the time to do it.
Well, I guess I wanted to, in light of Jim's last story, which was really a remarkable one, I want to point out the extent to which we inhabit alternate histories, right? The book I'm working on now is called The Lost Cause. That is the alternate history, contrafactual history of what's gone on. Holocaust deniers are living alternate histories. Alternate history is maybe another name for contested past. And the fact that these alternate histories have so much political salience actually tells you a lot about how serious this seemingly frivolous nature of this task of making up what if it happened differently stories really amounts to.
Dana?
Oh, sorry. From thinking of the history time period that I played with for a while, I'm sitting here thinking, what if FDR had succeeded in planting trees all the way from Texas, from the Mexican to the Canadian border, and that the Soil Conservation Service had actually never happened? So that was kind of one of those weird little things that nobody knows about. That it's like, yeah, FDR said, here's how we're going to solve the problem. And this gentleman comes in and says, no, we're going to solve it this way by teaching farmers how to take care of the land instead. So what would have been the consequence of that? That's an interesting idea. I learned a lot studying that time period.
John?
Something I think we don't see enough of is there are people who are extremely promising who unfortunately in our timeline died young. And the potential, for example, of the guy who was George II's son and should have been the next king of Britain. He was George III's father, Frederick. Splendid person in many, many ways. Might have been one of the great kings of England, and would have been very useful to have that guy be the king rather than George III.
I wallow in alternate history because it enables me to indulge my my primary intellectual hobby, which is, as you can see, involves lots and lots of history books, and make a living at it. So I'm in hog heaven. And since I got fired from every other job I've had except writing fiction, or quit,
John, you reminded me of another very good book, the World Fantasy Award-winning novel Glimpses by Lou Shiner. That is a Creative Commons licensed download that anyone can get for free right now. And it's about someone who goes into a fugue state in which he can hear records that were never recorded by the likes of Janis Joplin and John Lennon and Jimi Hendrix, and eventually travels to meet them in a kind of dream world. It is a novel that I can't read without choking up. It is a beautifully written novel. And a very sad and smart novel about music and genius.
We live in a literature of what if, and it makes sense that we look at what if in history. Also, I really enjoy this because I asked a question about research, and for me, the answer is you shouldn't be writing alternate history if you don't have a smattering of the history you're writing about. Like, you shouldn't be writing about baseball if you don't know anything about baseball. Don't write about horses if you don't know anything about horses. You need to know something about history to write well about it. And as soon as you start looking at it, you expand your life, because you give yourself a broader perspective to look at yourself and to look at your society, because you're not here uniquely. You're here. You're not here without getting here through a process. And the culture you're living here got here through a process. And the study of history is about process quite a bit, how people came to be who they are and why they think about the way they are. And I recommend it highly. I think you've all heard some great titles maybe to find and read on your own, including ones Corey mentioned that you can get just for free. But you can fill authors' pockets with money too. So all these authors have works that are worthy of your money, and I hope you find them. Is our, let me see, our moderator, or I had a down to 2 minutes by my watch, 1 minute and 55 seconds ago. So I think that ends us.
So can I say one last thing, which I've been asked to say at the end of every panel, which is that the Con bookstore has signed book plates from the guests of honor. And so you can order our most recent books and have them sent to you signed.
Yes, that's the Book Bar.
Yeah, that's right.
You want to go to, and they have signed nameplates to put inside the participating authors. So you can get a signed copy of the book, even if we're not here for real.
Mhm.
All right, well, panelists, thank you very much. I thought this was a great panel. I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Thank
Yeah, it was
you.
fun.
It was
Thank you for
fun.
your moderation, Jim.
I wanted to say thank you guys so very much for coming and sharing all of your knowledge. It was truly amazing. I'm sure all the attendees would love to say the same to you directly. But thank you guys so much.
You recorded this one so people can play it back later. There'll be a YouTube of it. Is that what I understand?
Yes, sir. It is all set up to record. I believe it'll be set up to YouTube. I'm not quite sure exactly how they're going to do it. I honestly run operations usually, so all this tech stuff is way over my head.
I've got to scramble on because I've got another panel to be at. So
All right.
Yes.
I'll be there.
Nice
Thank
to
you
talk to
again
John.
so much, guys.
Dana,
You're
Steve,
welcome.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.